In this point in the lecture in period three, we're going to move beyond the industrialization of the Western states like we see in Britain and the United States, and move into the effects and reactions of that industrialization and imperialism on non-European empires. So places like the Ottoman Empire, which will eventually, after World War I, be dismantled into what is modern day Turkey with its capital in Istanbul. We're also going to look at the effects on China as it becomes carved up into spheres of influence amongst the imperial powers, and Japan, which in response to gunboat diplomacy is going to rapidly modernize and become an imperial power in contrast to Turkey and China, which eventually decrease or weaken their power in response to interference from the West. So all three of these empires, in the Ottoman Empire, the Qing dynasty in China, and the Tokugawa and eventually Meiji dynasty in Japan, are going to have to grapple with modernization. They're going to be forced to modernize due to Western dominance. And what caused that Western dominance in period three was the Industrial Revolution. So we see a pretty drastic change over time, whereas in periods 1 through periods 2, Europe wasn't doing too great. Okay, they had come out of their dark ages, they had moved into the Renaissance, but during that Renaissance, they had attempted to gather as much information and technology as they could from more advanced civilizations in Africa and the Middle East and in China. Now in period 3 through period 4, we see a drastic change where Europe and the West, i.e. the United States, is going to increase in power and clout as it becomes the center of technology and modernization due to the Industrial Revolution beginning in Britain and giving them a head start with industrialization and manufacturing, and thus a military advantage with new military technologies like the Maxim gun. Okay, so these states, these empires, are going to have to react to Western interference and dominance, and they are going to be forced to modernize, because back in periods 1 through 2, the focus of the Ottoman Empire and China and Japan had been on preserving their traditional values. The Chinese, under the Tang and the Song dynasty, viewed foreigners as inferior and wanted to keep out foreign influence, thus limiting their trading ports to just one port for foreigners. Japan actually went into a period of isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate, which was ended after gunboat diplomacy from the United States in 1953, which led to the fall of the Tokugawa and the restoration of the emperor's power with the Meiji Restoration. So essentially, we are looking at this conflict between the preservation of traditional values and modernizing. But there is no stopping the march of time. All of these empires are going to have to modernize eventually. Japan does it successfully and extremely rapidly, thus rising as an imperial power in Asia. But the Ottoman Empire, unfortunately for them, do not modernize quickly enough to prevent dissolution. And China is going to very slowly industrialize, which is going to also lead to increased interference by Western powers. But the first one that we're going to look at in this specific video is the eventual slow decline of the Ottoman Empire, aka the sick man of Europe. Okay, they are going to be dismantled after World War I, but it does take a while for that eventual fall to happen, as opposed to when the Ottoman Empire took over the Byzantine Empire in 1453, and then it was bam, 1453, no more Byzantine Empire. Now we're Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is going to be a slow decline, hence earning this nickname. Now, the causes behind this, we do see overexpansion by the Ottoman Empire. We know that expansion is very expensive. And we know that when governments need money, they tend to raise taxes, which the population tends to be against. So here you can see the extent of the Ottoman Empire covering 3 whole continents. And so that is a lot of territory to control. And the sultans, as we know, are going to become weaker and weaker as the viziers increase their authority over the sultans, remembering that in the Ottoman Empire, there had been a continuity of the rising sultan getting rid of his competition, i.e. his brothers. And so we see an increased emphasis on protecting potential sultans, and they don't really get much of a chance to experience life in a way that gives them background for future rule. And so that leads to weak leadership on the part of the sultans, and thus rampant corruption amongst the civil servants, amongst the government. We also see an issue with failure to modernize. They had not adapted Western technology or Enlightenment ideals because those Enlightenment ideals were more secular. And remember that they had struggled with the contrast, with the conflict between preserving their traditional culture and values versus bringing in foreign cultural values like the Enlightenment ideals. Y'all may remember that Sultan Murad IV of the Ottoman Empire actually banned coffee houses, not only because they were quote unquote dens of iniquity that promoted nicotine use and caffeine consumption, but also because they promoted the spread or cultural diffusion of Enlightenment ideals out of Europe and into the Ottoman Empire, which the Ottoman Empire didn't have an interest in democracy, right? Because they were ruled by a sultan, which is an absolute ruler. They weren't interested in secularism, right? They were interested in religion and the use of religion to prop up government power and to prop up the legal system. One example being the fact that the Sultan was not only the leader of the government, the political leader, but also the leader of the Islamic faith in the Ottoman Empire. And again, with the focus on Sharia law in the Ottoman Empire, and civil servants or ulama being experts in Islamic law dating back to Suleiman the Magnificent or Suleiman the lawgiver. Okay, so all of this means a lack of cultural diffusion, not only of secular ideas like the Enlightenment, but also a lack of diffusion of Western technology, which we know Britain is about to enter into its industrial revolution, which means they are going to have quite a few advancements in technology, not just in terms of textiles or manufacturing other goods, but also advancements in military technology, which is going to put the Ottoman Empire at a disadvantage if they don't get their hands on that kind of technology. And then lastly, you may remember from our lecture on the Ottoman Empire in period 2 that the Ottoman Empire was very diverse because it's very large. It covers 3 continents. There's going to be a lot of different types of people with a lot of different religious beliefs, a lot of different spoken languages. And so we see that in the Ottoman Empire, they're going to be very religiously tolerant. The Christian faith can be practiced, the Jewish faith can be practiced, the Zoroastrian faith from Persia can be practiced in these autonomous religious communities known as millets. As long as you pay the jizya, okay, the tax for being a non-Muslim, you can practice your religion within the Ottoman Empire. However, that does become an issue when it comes to nationalism. We're going to see increased nationalism or the desire to create nations separate from the Ottoman Empire. So parts of the Ottoman Empire are going to try attempting breaking off and creating their own nations. Most notably, Egypt essentially carves out its own little territory here where the Sultan can't do much about the governor of Egypt ruling. And then over in the Mediterranean in Greece, we're going to see a resistance movement that eventually in 1831 results in the independence of Greece. So first up, we are going to look at the increase in Egyptian autonomy as the Ottoman Empire slowly declines. And this starts with the rise of Muhammad Ali. So how this happened was the sultans had little power in Egypt. Egypt had been taken over by the Mamluks, who were former Turkish slaves that were actually very progressive in their military strategies. And so they were fierce warriors. They are going to take control of Egypt from the sultans, from the Ottoman Empire. However, after the Mamluks take control, then the French under Napoleon Bonaparte come in to Egypt, wanting to conquer it, to expand the empire. And Napoleon, you may have heard of him. He is very, very good at conquering things, a fairly good general. So he does end up taking Egypt from the Mamluks, but then going back into Europe, dealing with the balance of power in conflict with other European nations like Russia and Britain. France is going to have some trouble ruling over Egypt because of the distance and because of their own domestic troubles. And so the Mamluks rise again and defeat the French. Okay, this means that the Ottoman Empire see an opening. They see an opening to reestablish control over Egypt. And so the Sultan sent an army to take control of Egypt in 1801. And Muhammad Ali was one of the military generals that was successful in that campaign. And due to rising popularity, he is going to become the governor of Egypt. So the Sultan is supposed to have absolute power, both the religious and the political leader of the Ottomans. However, while the Sultan is supposed to have centralized rule, the sultans have been decreasing in power over time. We know that due to the continuity of a power struggle between absolute rulers and other elite in society, that means that that power has got to go somewhere. And that power, in this case, is going to go to Muhammad Ali as he becomes the governor or the de facto ruler of Egypt. And the Sultan really didn't have much of a choice here. The Sultan is weak, the Sultan is losing power, and Muhammad Ali has an entire army that he just used to defeat the Mamluks. And so the Sultan essentially has to share power with Muhammad Ali. And he is going to use Muhammad Ali to promote the Ottoman Empire. But in doing this, we do see that Muhammad Ali is going to make the Sultan make concessions, okay, that the Sultan doesn't want to have to make. So after Ali defeats the Mamluk leaders, he wants more power. The Sultan had asked him for a favor. The Sultan said, hey, can you go into Saudi Arabia? Okay. So the governor of Egypt, go into Saudi Arabia to take back the holy cities of Mecca and Medina from the Wahhabis, the Islamic fundamentalists. So Ali was personally requested by the Sultan to take back this territory for the Ottoman Empire, and he does so. However, he doesn't stop there. He also sends military campaigns into Sudan without the Sultan's permission in 1820. So again, showing the autonomy, the independence that Ali had in his expansion of his own power at the expense of the Sultan. Again, that historical continuity of conflict between the absolute rulers and other powerful or wealthy elites. Now, the Sultan is going to ask him for help again. Greece, okay, attempts to rebel due to nationalism. They want to become their own independent state, separate from the Ottoman Empire. And so the Sultan goes to Muhammad Ali again for help. But Ali doesn't work for free. So he says, if I help you, I have to get more territory. You have to give me Crete. So the Sultan agrees. So it is the Ottoman Empire plus Egypt under Muhammad Ali's forces versus this rebellion in Greece. That doesn't look very balanced, right? It looks like the Ottoman Empire and the Egyptian army are going to be able to defeat the Greeks. However, those are not the only players on the field. We also see Europeans like Russia and France and Great Britain joining the fray, which is weird, right? Why would they get involved in this war, this battle that doesn't have anything to do with them? Well, it's because of the balance of power. The Ottoman Empire is large. Okay, the Ottoman Empire, while it is weakening, is still a power that the Europeans have to contend with. And so to weaken the Ottoman Empire, these European empires side up with the rebels, and they are going to win. Okay, the Europeans win the Battle of Navarino, which means that in 1832, Greece is no longer a part of the Ottoman Empire. Now it is its own independent nation. Now, after Muhammad Ali dies, his son Ibrahim Ibrahim is going to take his position as the governor of Egypt. And like his father, he is going to want to gather more power to expand his territory. So he straight up fights the Ottoman Empire. He invades Syria due to its trade centers and valuable resources that can enable him to make more money and thus more or become more powerful. He straight up invades the Ottoman Empire from 1831 to 1832. Now, in this case, the Ottoman Empire is going to gain allies in the form of the Europeans. So the Europeans had just fought the Ottoman Empire to make Greece independent. Why would they all of a sudden help the Ottoman Empire against the Egyptians? Well, it's because the Europeans were once again afraid of an imbalance of power. They're afraid that if the Ottoman Empire fell and fell suddenly, the Egyptian government could take over, and they hadn't contended with the Egyptian government yet. Okay, so it's better to stick with the enemy that you know rather than the enemy that you don't know. So the Europeans, to maintain that balance of power, are going to force Egypt out of Ottoman territories. Ali's descendants are going to continue to rule in Egypt, but with more limited powers due to the threat of European interference and intervention. So the Ottoman Empire is going to continue to limp along despite this setback. We do see that Muhammad Ali is going to attempt to modernize because, again, to modernize means to advance. And so he doesn't want to fall behind. He wants to move forward. So as a reformer, i.e., as a person pushing through change, okay, he is going to modernize Egypt. And he's able to do this because of the power that he's taken from the Sultan. He has autonomy or independence. So some of the reforms or changes that he makes includes changing the military. He moves away from the coerced labor of the Dafshirmi system with the Janissaries and towards a conscription service. So with this, what happens is all men, all citizens, male citizens, after a certain age, will have to serve in the military. They don't have to serve for life, they don't have to serve for decades, but they do have to serve for a period of time. This is common in some countries, like in Israel and Korea. I believe it's a 2-year conscription where you do your 2 years and then you can go back to school or go back to your job or start your career, so on and so forth. But you do, as a citizen, have to serve in the military. Now compare that with the Sultan's army, full of professional, lifelong soldiers. The Janissaries are going to be highly organized and they're going to be extremely loyal to the Sultan. Okay, but again, those Enlightenment ideals of life, liberty, and property don't really mesh with the idea of coerced labor like we see with the Janissaries. And eventually the Janissaries are going to be retired. This feudalistic system of coerced labor in the military is going to end, similar to what we see in Japan, where the samurai are eventually going to be retired. So we do see that as we move out of period 3 and into period 4, that decreases. He's also going to establish schools which help with secularization. Okay, so a focus on reason and logic as opposed to religion. So we see an increase in secularization through the establishment of schools. We see cultural diffusion of secular ideas like the Enlightenment through press. So the first newspaper in the Islamic world is going to be started under Muhammad Ali. And even beyond that, he is going to continue with this cultural diffusion by speeding it up and translating European texts into Arabic. So back in periods 1 and 2, once we get into the Renaissance in Europe, we saw that the Europeans were going to the Middle East and to Africa and into Asia to glean all of the advancements in technology and knowledge that those other empires had managed to accumulate during their golden age. Now we see a reverse. Now empires in the Middle East and Asia are going to Europe for their technology, for their modernization from the Industrial Revolution. But speaking of industrialization, Muhammad Ali does want to industrialize in Egypt, but Egypt doesn't have colonies that they can exploit raw materials from. So instead, they look within their territory. They take control of land by out-taxing the peasants, essentially taxing the peasants until they were forced to sell their land, until they could no longer afford to be their own bosses, doing their own skilled labor on their own land. This is similar to what we saw in Britain with the enclosure movement. When Parliament closed the commons and bought up all of the remaining land and eventually bought out the small struggling farmers, forcing the farmers to move to the cities to work in the factories. So we see something similar here in Egypt as Egypt attempts to industrialize, because you need those raw materials. Can't make textiles without cotton. Okay, so that's why we see those changes in land reform. But enough about Egypt. Let's move over into the Ottoman Empire itself in Istanbul. So we know that the ruler of the Ottoman Empire is the Sultan. Now, for a long time, the sultans and their religious scholars, the ulama, resisted modernization. But eventually, we are going to see some absolute rulers who attempt to modernize. So Sultan Selim III is going to attempt to reform the military and the government. Now, the military had a lot of elites known as the Janissaries. The government was run by Islamic scholars known as the ulama. They don't want a change. They are doing just fine. The Janissaries get good pay, medical care. They're considered elites in the military. They're highly respected. They've moved up in society by entering the Devshirme system. Okay, they're close to the Sultan. The ulama don't want reforms because they're scared of secularization. Secularization, as it increases, that decreases the power of religion. So increased secularization leads to decreased power of religion. Okay, and they want to preserve their traditional values and culture. And so they join forces. Okay, the conservative ulamas and the Janissaries joined forces to execute Sultan Selim III. So he is unsuccessful in his reforms, but his successor is going to learn from those mistakes and be a little bit more proactive when it comes to putting down opposition. So Sultan Mahmud II, not the conqueror, like from 1453, this is a different Mahmud, he is going to be successful in his reforms. He is going to abolish the Janissaries by taking 5 years to properly plan. He modernizes his military by forming an artillery unit. He trained by Europeans in how to use European guns like the Maxim gun or the machine gun. So when he abolishes the Janissary system and the Janissaries rebel, he is going to loose that new army onto the Janissaries and massacre them. So no more Janissaries to stand in the way of reform. Then he is going to abolish the antiquated feudal system, because again, with Enlightenment ideals, that is on the way out. Now we see the rise of a middle class and an industrial class. He's also going to expand infrastructure to aid in communication, to tie the empire together, and to help with trade and cultural diffusion, and decrease corruption by having the government take over charities to make sure that the charities are legit instead of just collecting money for themselves. So overall, he's going to be very successful with his attempts at reform. So successful that due to the fact that he has eliminated the threat of the Janissaries, these reforms are going to continue after his rule with the Tanzimat reforms. So with the Tanzimat reforms, like with the charities, he's going to try to eliminate government corruption. He is going to increase modernization and secularization through the school system. The school system is going to have primary schools, which is like elementary, secondary schools, middle school and high school, and then colleges, where you can specialize in secular fields like engineering or translation or civil service. Okay, so all of that is going to contribute to modernization. We're also going to see the expansion of infrastructure with canals for maritime trade and railroads, which we see emerging first in Britain and then spreading throughout Europe and going beyond Europe through cultural diffusion. He also codifies the Ottoman laws, just like Suleiman the Magnificent did, creating new ones. This is going to make it easier for foreigners and traders to understand the laws, but we also see more secularization of the laws. So we're moving away from Sharia law and more towards Enlightenment ideals, like with the Hadi Humayun, the Ottoman Reform Edict that declared equality for all men. Notice how it's leaving out women, but it does declare equality for all men, the ideals of democracy and natural rights. So we see a movement away from Sharia law and religion and government being together, i.e. a theocracy, to religion and government being separate, following these Enlightenment ideals. However, we don't see the complete disappearance of religion. For instance, the fez, okay, is a military hat that is going to adapt to Islam. It allows the forehead to touch the ground during prayer. So again, just like how the Enlightenment in Europe didn't lead to a wave of atheism, okay, there's still religion. Same thing in the Ottoman Empire. There's still a focus on the Islamic faith. However, both Abrahamic religions are going to protest these changes in these laws. Okay, the Christians are going to be against these reforms because they fear losing the independence of their millet communities. And the Muslims are going to be against these new laws because they believe that these laws conflicted with their traditional values. So again, the goal of preserving traditional values and culture as opposed to changing it or allowing it to become diluted through cultural diffusion. But unfortunately for the traditionalists, they are going to be unsuccessful in preserving their culture as well as their power, because European power is going to increase at the expense of Ottoman power. We see the Ottoman loss of territory due to nationalism is going to result in new countries that emerge that claim to be separate from the Ottoman Empire. So particularly over here in the Balkans, we see the Ottoman Empire losing a lot of territory in 1832. We already talked about how Greece gained their independence, but we also see territories like Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia that are going to break off from the Ottoman Empire, and then European countries like Russia and Austria-Hungary are going to claim that those territories are under their protection. So the Ottoman Empire isn't going to be able to go into those territories and take them back like they did with the Mamluks in Egypt. Instead, the Europeans are saying, no, these are now European. Okay, so you need to butt out. So again, sick man of Europe. They cannot put up that kind of resistance to the Europeans. The Europeans have become too powerful due to the Industrial Revolution. And this is going to have an impact on the Ottoman economy. Okay, so the Ottoman economy, as well as society, okay, workers are going to be paid in cash. So we see banking increasing. Most of the industrial jobs, the industrialization as it spreads, are going to go to men, okay, due to stronger gender roles within the Ottoman Empire. But we do still see some impacts on women in the Ottoman Empire at this time, despite most of the factory jobs still being delegated to men. Legal reforms, like what we saw under the Tanzimat reforms, are going to decrease women's rights. They're going to take away property rights that women had that were guaranteed under Sharia law. Under Sharia law, women could have money, they could inherit their dowry, they could be educated. After the Mahmed reforms and Tanzimat reforms, women are no longer going to be able to distribute their property or their money, even directly. And you do see some women still being able to attend schools, but overall, women's rights due to industrialization are going to decrease. The fight for gender equality is going to be slowed down significantly by this change, because as you may remember, the Ottoman Reform Edict declared equality for all men, not necessarily including women in that declaration of equality. Also, in terms of economic decline, we see European interference in the Ottoman Empire. So Germany is going to start investing in railways because railways can move manufactured goods and raw materials in bulk very quickly. So that can make a quick profit. So Germany wanted to create a rail line from Baghdad to Berlin, so the capital of Germany to Baghdad. Lots of territory being covered there. So they reached out to the Ottoman Empire and said, hey, we want to do this. Would you like to benefit with us from this infrastructure? So banking offices are going to be set up in the capital of the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, because the Ottomans agree to this deal of you can build your railway in our empire, and then we get economic benefit from it, as well as you, Germany. Okay, and the Ottomans agree, but Germany wants some concessions. They want extraterritoriality. This is the right of foreigners to live under their country's laws rather than the laws of the countries in which they are residing currently. So this would be like if a student from another school, let's say Hoover High School, doesn't have a dress code. The kids can wear sweatpants and jeans every day. Well, let's say that Tom, this kid from Hoover, moves to Montgomery and enrolls at Lamp. But while he's enrolled at Lamp, he claims that he should have extraterritoriality. He shouldn't have to follow the dress code of Lamp and MPS. He should get to continue to follow the dress code of Hoover High School. So he shows up every day in his jeans and t-shirt or in his sweatpants. Well, how is that going to make the students at school, at Lamp, feel that they have to follow Lamp's dress code, but this student who transferred doesn't have to follow this dress code? Well, it's going to lead to social unrest. Okay, and so that's going to be a big issue for the Ottoman Empire, especially with the rise of ethnic nationalism and animosity towards foreigners. Germany is also going to demand other capitulations or concessions. Okay, these are deals made to the foreign government, certain rights or privileges that they are going to be able to get, advantages that they are going to get. These advantages economically drain the Ottoman Empire, which again leads to unrest, especially as that conflicts with the rising Turkification movement. Okay, Turkification was this cultural movement to make the Ottoman Empire more Turkish as opposed to more European. So again, the preservation of their traditional values and culture. So they want all Ottoman citizens to be as Turkish as possible. Thus, we see the rise of nationalist groups like the Young Turks. Now, all of this is going to combine together, this Turkification and anti-foreigner sentiment and the exploitation of foreigners economically in the Ottoman Empire leads to conflict. Okay, fewer exports for the Ottoman Empire and weakened agriculture leads to unrest. Now, the Ottomans do eventually ally with Germany in World War I due to these connections, but we know as historians that World War I is the end of the Ottoman Empire. It has become too divided. Okay, it is no longer as powerful as it used to be as a gunpowder empire, and thus it is going to become fragmented and fall apart after this global war. Okay, but because of this rising nationalism and anti-foreigner sentiment, we are going to see some war crimes. There is a genocide that occurs in Turkey against the Christian Armenians. So because they were Christian, okay, same as the Europeans, the Turks, the young Turks who promote Islam, are going to claim that the Christian Armenians were to blame for this European exploitation, for this economic decline. They claim that the Christian Armenians must be on the side of the Europeans purely because they are Christian. Okay, so it's that anti-foreigner sentiment, thus resulting in the Armenian genocide, okay, in the time period of World War I. Again, this is not going to be the only genocide that we see in world history. We are coming up on World War II with the Holocaust. But again, rising nationalism plays a role in the Holocaust's genocide, just as we see it here in the Ottoman Turkish genocide of the Armenians.